State park cabins you can lease for life. The $2.500/year government land deal nobody talks about. Most people assume that if you want to live beside water, you either inherit money or you don't. You save for decades, you buy at the peak of the market, and you spend the rest of your life paying for the view. But what if I told you that assumption is wrong in a way that almost nobody has discovered? What if the cheapest way to own a lakefront life isn't through real estate at all? It's through a legal arrangement so old and so quiet that your neighbors probably don't even know it exists. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to show you how 5 different states have quietly left the door open for ordinary people to live on government water for less than the cost of a decent truck payment per year. And one of those states has a loophole so generous that I still don't understand why the waiting list isn't 3,000 people long. If you've spent any time thinking about where you want to live someday, drop a comment and tell me, what's the one thing that would make a place feel like home? Is it the water, the quiet, just enough distance from other people that you stop hearing their TVs through the walls? Because that answer matters for what comes next. And before we get any deeper, hit subscribe. The stories I'm about to walk you through, they're the kind that change how you think about where your life could happen. You don't want to miss the properties I'm about to show you. Okay, hold on. I need you to understand something fundamental before we go any further. Most of the internet real estate advice you consume is built on one assumption: property ownership equals freedom. Own the land, own the future. But that narrative is calculated to serve exactly one group of people: those who can afford to play the real estate appreciation game. For everyone else, there's something different happening in the background. There's a counterintuitive truth that the government has been practically begging people to understand for the last 50 years. The states control more pristine waterfront acreage than most people can conceptualize. We're not talking about swamps or rocky shorelines. We're talking about the kind of water access that would cost $3 million if a developer got their hands on it. And because these lands were set aside for public benefit, education funds, conservation, revenue generation, the states are legally obligated to lease them, not hoard them. But here's the part that stops most people cold. They've set up a system where you can lease not just the land, but often a cabin that's already built on it, for prices that feel like a clerical error. The catch, and I want to name it plainly, is that you're not buying. You're entering into a contract, you lease the cabin and the ground beneath it for a set term, usually 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. When that term ends, you walk away. The state can choose not to renew. You can't pass it to your kids. You can't flip it for profit. You get exactly what you're paying for, a place to live beside the water for as long as the lease holds. And that's where most people stop listening. They hear lease and they think temporary, and they decide it's not worth their time. But they're making the calculation wrong. A temporary lease isn't temporary in the way an apartment lease is temporary. It's a decade and a half of waking up to loon calls. It's 15 years of your name on a contract that says you belong there. That's not nothing. For a lot of people, that's everything. Before we talk about which states have these deals available right now, you need to know what the complete guide to navigating these leases actually involves. There are mechanisms I haven't mentioned yet: the bidding process, the fine print about improvements you can make, the rules about what happens if the state's land use priorities shift. The full depth of how to actually secure one of these cabins without hitting a wall is explained in the detailed guide I've built, available in the description and pinned in the comments. It's the resource that shows you step by step how to navigate applications, what inspections to expect, and which states have the most generous renewal terms. This is paid content, and it exists because there's real value in knowing the rules before you step into the game. Montana is where we start, and for a specific reason. The state lands office there runs the cleanest operation in the country. They lease roughly 1,500 parcels of trust land, land that was set aside generations ago to fund schools and public infrastructure. Some of those parcels come with cabins already standing. Last year, leases on lakefront Montana cabin sites started at around $1,700 per year for a 15-year term. That's not a typo. One family I spoke with leased a cabin on Flathead Lake, genuinely one of the most beautiful bodies of water in North America, for $24,000 over 15 years. They divided that by 12 and got $2,000 a month for a lakefront address in one of the most sought-after regions of the country. How does that work? Because you're not paying for the land's appreciated value. The state doesn't benefit if you improve the cabin. You're not building equity. You're simply trading money for access, and that transaction doesn't have to follow the rules of the property market. Wyoming operates a similar system, but with a different philosophy. Their state lands office has cabins scattered across some of the most remote and beautiful country in the West. Fish Creek near Thermopolis, Mirror Lake up in the Bighorn Range. Annual lease payments there run between $1,200 and $3,500, depending on proximity to water and the condition of the structure. One cabin I found listed on the state system, a 2-bedroom with a full kitchen and a view of the Wind River, is leasing for just under $3,000 per year. The catch with Wyoming is simpler than with Montana. The leases are shorter. Many run only 10 years. When they end, you're out. No automatic renewal. No negotiation. The state takes back the property and you start from zero. But that's also a feature, not a bug, for some people. Shorter commitment, lower overall risk. And the annual cost is so low that even a decade of use works out to a remarkable bargain. But here's where the real story starts to move in a direction most people don't expect. Oregon does something different. The state doesn't lease cabins the way Montana and Wyoming do. Instead, it auctions off long-term permits to occupy small structures on public land, mostly yurts, some rustic cabins, sitting on bureau land parcels that the state co-manages with the feds. The permits run 20 years, sometimes longer. The winning bid on a recent one went for $4,800 upfront, then $300 a year in maintenance fees. You're not paying lakefront prices because you're not buying anything permanent. You own the right to be there, nothing more. The structure itself, that belongs to the state. But your name is on the lease, and that means something. What's strange about Oregon is that most people who get these permits never talk about them. They're not the flashy, Instagram-ready lakefront cabins you see in magazines. They're quieter, smaller, tucked into places where the cell signal is weak and the nearest neighbor is a mile away. That's the appeal for the people who actually want them. Not a status symbol, just escape. Now, before we go any further, and I mean this sincerely, if you're genuinely serious about tracking down these deals across multiple states and understanding the legal fine print that makes or breaks each arrangement, our complete guide on this topic is waiting in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. It breaks down every state's system, the bidding mechanics, the lease terms you need to watch for, and the renovation costs most people completely overlook. It's the deep dive version of what we're covering here. Idaho enters the picture differently. The state manages roughly 2 million acres of endowment land, held in trust to generate revenue for public schools. And on some of those acres, scattered across the Central Mountains and the Northern Panhandle, the state allows long-term cabin leases. The arrangement is simple. You pay a ground lease at a rate that adjusts every 5 years based on timber values and land assessments. Current rates average around $600 to $1,400 annually, depending on location and water access. Some of the leases have run for 30, 40 years without interruption. Families have built generational ties to these places. The difference with Idaho is tenure. If you maintain the lease, pay your annual fee on time, and keep the structure in reasonable condition, you can renew indefinitely. It's not guaranteed. The state can choose not to renew, but in practice, it almost always does. The economics favor it. A stable, long-term leaseholder paying a modest fee is worth more to the state than an empty lot or a derelict structure. So Idaho leases feel less temporary than Wyoming's, more accessible than Montana's competitive bidding. Hold on, this is where the comparison gets important, and I need you to pay close attention for a moment. The real decision you're facing isn't which state has the cheapest cabin, it's which state's arrangement matches how you actually want to live. Montana offers prestige and natural beauty, but demands you win against other bidders and accept a 15-year window. Wyoming costs less, but gives you shorter security. Oregon asks you to embrace the unconventional yurts instead of cabins, isolation instead of a view. Idaho promises stability if you're willing to accept uncertainty around renewal. Each one solves a different version of the same problem. You want to live on land you don't own. You want it cheap, you want it to last, and you want to know the rules won't change tomorrow. No state offers all four perfectly, but Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, and Idaho each get you closest to 3 out of 4. The fifth state is the one that changes the entire calculation. It's the one where the lease doesn't just feel stable, it genuinely is, by law, for the rest of your life. That state is Washington. And what Washington offers isn't just different from the others. It's the reason some people have stopped looking anywhere else entirely. Washington manages roughly 5.5 million acres of state forest land. Like Montana, like Idaho, the state acquired much of it decades ago for revenue, timber sales, school funding, future development. Unlike most states, though, Washington made a choice 20 years back to designate certain parcels as permanent recreation and habitat areas. Those parcels don't move. They don't get sold, they don't get logged, they get leased. The cabin leases in Washington run for 50 years. 50 years. Not 10, not 15, 50. That's the full arc of a working life. That's watching your children grow old enough to have children of their own. That's planting trees and actually seeing them mature. That's building a library you'll read through multiple times. That's not borrowing a place, that's claiming it. The price sits around $3,000 a year for most of the leases. Some go lower. One I found in the northeastern quadrant of the state, near the Kettle River, runs $1,800 annually. It's a 2-room cabin with a wood stove, a cistern for water, and about 80 acres of forest wrapped around it like a moat. The nearest town is 40 minutes away. The nearest neighbor is 2 miles. The silence is complete. When I called the leaseholder, a man named David, who'd lived there for 12 years, I asked him the question you're probably asking right now. Why doesn't everybody do this? Why isn't this the obvious play? Why are people still taking 30-year mortgages on 2-bedroom houses in suburbs they didn't choose? David laughed quietly. He said, because most people don't believe it exists until they're standing in it. And that's the friction, really. Washington's leases aren't hidden, but they're not marketed like a real estate listing either. They sit in the Washington Department of Natural Resources database. You have to actively search for them. You have to understand the system exists. You have to be willing to move to a place with no Uber, no same-day delivery, no cell service in most directions. You have to accept that your cabin will probably never increase in value. You have to understand that you own the structure, but not the soil. And that distinction matters legally in ways most people never think about. Before we go deeper into what that legal distinction actually means for you, and why it matters in ways that could save you tens of thousands of dollars, I want to mention something. The complete mechanism behind how these state leases work, which ones renew, what happens when a lease ends, the tax implications, and the exact steps to actually win one of these in a bidding process, all of that is laid out in depth in our guide. You'll find it in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. It's the resource that walks you through the patterns and the actual mechanics that most people miss. The distinction between owning the cabin and owning the land operates differently depending on which state you're in and which specific lease agreement you're signing. In Washington, you're essentially the perpetual tenant with ownership of your improvement. The state can theoretically reclaim the land if the lease expires and they choose not to renew, but in practice, with 50-year leases, that's already happened to roughly 0 people. The renewal rate on Washington leases runs north of 95%. It's not automatic, but it's far more likely than not. The tax implications are where it gets interesting. You pay property tax on the cabin itself, but not on the land. In states where land comprises 40 to 60% of the total property value, you're looking at tax bills that run anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 what you'd pay on equivalent land ownership. Over 50 years, that compounds into serious money. One cabin holder in Washington, a woman named Margaret who took a lease in 2009 on a place near the Columbia River, ran the numbers with her accountant. If she'd purchased an equivalent cabin on private land, her property taxes alone would have exceeded $40,000 over that decade. Her lease payments and cabin taxes combined came to roughly $22,000. The difference funded a second vehicle, a major roof replacement, and a new septic system. The catch, the thing that makes these leases less appealing to some people, is precisely what makes them appealing to others. You can't build equity in the traditional sense. You can't flip the property for profit. You can't leave it to your heirs. When the lease ends, whether that's in 50 years or whether you sell it before then, the cabin remains on the state's land. Your ownership of the structure evaporates. The next leaseholder gets a standing cabin that's half a century old, paid for by you, and they'll own it for 50 more years at a fraction of what it's worth. Some people find that thought unbearable. The idea of pouring decades of work and money into something that doesn't become a generational asset bothers them deeply. And that's a legitimate perspective. Real estate, in the American imagination, is supposed to be wealth building. It's supposed to appreciate. It's supposed to pass down. A cabin on state land doesn't do any of that. But then again, a cabin on state land costs $3,000 a year. A comparable cabin on private land with a mortgage costs $200,000 down and $2,000 a month for 30 years. That's $920,000 total, plus property tax, plus insurance, plus maintenance on a building. That's entirely your responsibility if it burns. The economic question isn't whether one is objectively better. It's whether you're optimizing for asset accumulation or for the ability to live the life you actually want. Some people build their entire retirement strategy around that distinction. They see the state cabin not as a failure to accumulate, but as a deliberate choice to stop accumulating. To say, I have enough, I don't need more. What I need is morning coffee on a dock that's actually mine to sit on without checking my bank account first. That's not nothing. That's actually everything to some people. Which brings us to the mechanics of how you actually secure one of these leases. Frankly, this is where the real work starts. Because while the cabins exist and the prices are real, they don't advertise themselves. You won't find them on Zillow. You won't get a phone call from a realtor. They surface through state land offices, through bidding processes that change from state to state, through hunting and fishing magazines and local bulletin boards, where people who've already figured this out leave breadcrumbs for the next person. Montana's bidding season runs in the spring. Washington starts in the fall. Oregon has its own calendar entirely. To find your lease before someone else does, you need to actually know where to look. That's the unglamorous part nobody talks about. Not the romance of the cabin, not the deal itself, but the weeks or months of calling state offices, scrolling through PDF databases, asking locals which lakes still have openings, which cabins are actually maintained, which ones are slipping into the kind of disrepair that's one bad winter away from collapse. Before we continue, and I need you to keep this in mind for the next few minutes, the deeper mechanics of how to navigate each state's specific lease system, what paperwork you'll actually need, how to calculate whether a particular cabin's renovation costs will bankrupt you before you even move in, all of that lives in our complete guide. That's available in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. It walks you through the state-by-state processes, the hidden costs, the legal traps specific to each region. This is detailed stuff. The kind of information that saves you months of dead ends and thousands of dollars in mistakes. Right now, let's talk about what happens once you find a lease you want. The bidding process itself is usually straightforward. You submit a sealed bid, or sometimes an open auction, depending on the state, and the highest bid wins. That opening bid amount varies wildly. Some leases start at $500. Others start at $5,000. The winning bid is what you pay annually. But here's the critical part. That number almost never stays the same. Most state leases include what's called a reappraisal clause. Every 10 to 15 years, the state sends an appraiser out to value the land based on current market conditions. Your lease payment goes up accordingly. Not dramatically, usually, but enough that a cabin costing $3,000 a year in 2015 might cost $5,000 a year by 2030. That's still cheap compared to traditional property taxes, but it's not static. You're not buying a fixed rate on your freedom. You're leasing it with an expiration date and an increasing price attached. Some people can live with that arrangement indefinitely. For others, the knowledge that the cost will climb and the lease will eventually end creates a low-level anxiety they never quite shake off. The cabin itself, the actual structure, is yours to maintain, repair, and modify. Within limits. You can't tear it down and build a mansion. You can't subdivide it or rent it out to tourists for profit. But you can upgrade the plumbing, replace the roof, add solar panels, expand the deck. The labor materials are your expense. The liability is yours. If someone gets hurt on your property, your insurance covers it. If the building itself becomes structurally unsound, you're responsible for bringing it back to code before the state takes it back. That responsibility is the practical counterweight to the affordability. You're getting the land for nothing. The cabin comes with you as part of the lease. But the privilege of standing on that land and living in that cabin comes with the burden of keeping it from falling apart. Which raises a harder question. If you're going to spend the money and time maintaining a cabin you don't own, why not just buy a cabin outright? Why accept the lease term limits and the reappraisal increases and the knowledge that it's temporary? The answer depends entirely on your circumstances. Here is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video. The reason these leases matter, the reason they exist at all, is that they solve a problem most people don't realize they have. You think you need to own land to belong somewhere. That ownership is the only way to plant roots, to call a place home, to know it will be there next year and the year after. But that belief is exactly what keeps you from seeing what's sitting in front of you right now. These state leases are proof that you can have everything ownership promises you: stability, a view you love, a place to build a life, without the crushing weight of a mortgage, without the property taxes that climb every 5 years, without the burden of defending something you spent your entire adult life paying for 15 years, sometimes longer. You have that. The state won't auction your cabin to the highest bidder. They won't raise your lease cost to market rate because a developer wants your waterfront. You're protected by a contract that says what it says. And yes, eventually the lease ends. Yes, you have to maintain what you have. Yes, you're ultimately borrowing the ground. But so what? So what if the ground is borrowed when the life you're living on it is real? Most people will never take this seriously. They'll read about Montana leases and think it sounds complicated, or they'll look at the maintenance and think it sounds like work, or they'll focus on the 15-year limit and think it sounds temporary. They'll talk themselves out of it and go back to scrolling through million-dollar lakefront properties they can't afford. That's fine. Those leases will sit there, waiting for the people who actually want them. The real question isn't whether these cabins are worth your time. The real question is whether you're the kind of person who can see something that doesn't look like what the culture told you to want, and want it anyway. Whether you can recognize that 15 years of peace beside water you love might be worth more than a lifetime of payments for something you're too tired to enjoy. If that's you, then your next step is simple. Get your hands on the full guide I mentioned earlier, the one in the description, the one I've pinned in the comments. It walks you through the actual mechanics of how these leases work in each state, what the reappraisal process looks like, how to bid on a cabin when one comes available, and what happens when the lease expires. It's the deep map. You'll want it. Your challenge this week is simple. Pick one state: Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, Oregon, Minnesota. It doesn't matter which. Go to the State Lands Office website. Spend 30 minutes looking at what's actually available right now. Not as a dream, as a real option. Read the lease terms. Look at the photos. See if there's something there that speaks to you. You don't have to bid. You don't have to commit. Just look. Because the moment you start looking at real cabins on real leases for real prices, something shifts. The world starts to feel a little less locked. Your options start to feel a little less impossible. And sometimes, that shift is enough to change everything. Thanks for watching. If you found this valuable, please subscribe so you never miss when we find the next hidden deal. Hit that like button, leave a comment with whether you'd ever seriously consider a lease like this, and ring that notification bell so you're the first to know when the next video drops. I'll see you next time.